Sorry about that, guys. So we said that Piaget started out with the sensory motor stage, and then the pre-operational stage where kids start developing the ability to communicate using language and things of that nature. And then you have the formal operational stage, okay? Well, actually, I'm sorry, I've skipped one, the concrete operational stage. So the concrete operational stage, children are starting to engage in more logical thinking. So for example, if you've got two glasses and one glass is very tall but thin, and the other glass is really short but rather squat and fat, and you pour the water from one glass into the other glass, let's say you pour the water from the short glass, big round glass into the tall, thin glass, the water will come up higher. Children who are in the pre-operational stage would say that there's more water in the tall glass than there is in the short glass because it looks bigger, it looks taller, right? But children who've made it to the concrete operational stage would now say, well, wait a minute, it's the same amount of water. I saw you pour the water from one glass into the other. It's the exact same amount of water. So they are beginning to engage in more logical thinking. Very small children, if you take something and put it out of sight, it no longer exists. It's disappeared. It doesn't exist anymore. But older children who make it to that concrete operational stage, they'll say, oh, it's there. You've just hidden it. It's out of sight, but it's still there. Okay? And so there's a deeper level of understanding of the world in this concrete operational stage. And then in the formal operational stage, which I almost skipped to just a little bit early, now we see that during the period of adolescence, that kids start becoming capable of more sophisticated abstract thoughts. They can conceive of love, for example. You know, love is hard to define and it's hard to identify, but kids start becoming familiar with this concept of, hey, this is an abstract thought, an abstract concept, but here's what it means to love somebody. And so they start understanding things that are not easy to understand on their surface. Okay. So you've got table 4-2, theoretical approaches to the development of the self, and it talks, kind of summarizes Cooley's ideas, Mead, Goffman, Freud's ideas, as well as those of Piaget. Very useful. Now let's shift gears and talk a little bit about the various agents of socialization. And your textbook talks about, I guess there's what, six agents of socialization that they talk about. I would like to add a seventh one, and that is daycare. I don't believe that daycare has really been given the amount of attention that it deserves as an agent of socialization, but it kind of sort of falls into some of the other categories, which we'll talk about here momentarily. So these agents of socialization, of course, family is the number one. They get you earliest. They get you during your formative years, and the 24 hours a day care that you're provided by your family for as long as they can keep that up is instrumental in becoming who you become, right? But there are some other important agents of socialization. We've got schools, where we run into teachers and peers, both of which can have an impact on us. We've got our peer group, which tends to form once we start going to daycare or school, pre-kindergarten and first grade and all of that. We've got mass media and technology. It used to just be that we called this mass media, but today, because of the use of cell phones and the impact of it on our lives, we have to include other forms of technology, computers and things of that nature, smartphones and things of that nature, as part of our socializing influences or agents of socialization. Of course, the workplace, when you go into a new workplace with a new job, you have to learn how you're supposed to behave and what your duties are in that particular job. That can take a day or two, or it can take weeks or even months. I had a job at the Louisiana Commission on Law Enforcement where I had to spend a couple of months just reading reports that had been written by other people in the organization, and I had to meet with them one-on-one and have conversations about what their jobs entailed before I learned really what I was supposed to do in my job. And I got frustrated, to be honest with you, because I wanted to be doing some work, and they kept telling me, just wait, you need to learn what this organization does and what everybody in it does, and then you'll be given plenty of work, okay? So it took a little while, but I was getting a little frustrated. I wanted to get in there and start, getting my hands dirty and start doing some work, and they said, you're not ready yet. You need to spend more time learning about the organization. The religion certainly can be another important agent of socialization. Here in the United States, Christianity is a very important factor in a lot of people's lives. I grew up going to a Baptist church, but I'm not a religious person today. Please don't feel the need to pray for me. I'm just fine. But if you come from another country, or if you come from a different religious background than Christianity, you may kind of wonder why the United States seems to focus so much on things like Christmas, which is a Christian holiday, and things of that nature, when we have separation of church and state in this country. Okay, but Christianity has really become an important part of many people's lives here in the U.S. And then the state, and by the state we mean the government. So the government passes laws that we all have to adhere to and play by, and therefore they can have a tremendous impact on our behavior by telling us that, yes, you can smoke marijuana in this state, but not in that state. You can drive this fast, but not that fast. You can go to the military and join these various branches of the military, or you can go to college or whatever. We have all these different expectations and rules that govern our behavior, and the state or our government is a big part of establishing a lot of those rules. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about family. As I said already, I won't spend a tremendous amount of time on this because we already have talked a little bit about how family impacts us, providing that nurturing environment. All families engage in both explicit and implicit socialization. In other words, there are certain things that your parents are definitely trying to teach you, and then there are other things that you learn just through watching them interact with each other and with the world. Socialization is affected by both your gender and your race. If you belong to a particular racial category, the expectations may be a little different. We know, for example, that Asian American families focus on the family unit more than the individual, and so kids who grow up in Asian families or families of Asian background may have more of a focus on visiting with grandma and grandpa and other relatives than families that are not Asian. Okay. So the culture that you come from can have an influence, whereas kids who are see themselves as, hey, I'm an American citizen, and therefore, it's all about me. I'm going to decide what I want to do for a living. Even though my parents might want me to go into the family business, I'm going to do this. Even though my parents might want me to marry this person, I'm going to marry the person that I'm in love with. We're more individualistic in our decision making than a lot of cultures where you do things because your family expects it and wants you to do those things. Okay. Gender roles, in other words, what it's appropriate for males and females to do, what it means to be feminine and masculine. Those roles are really laid out by families. Families where it's more acceptable for boys to play with dolls or girls to climb trees might see that their kids are not as gendered as kids who grew up where this is what boys do, that's what girls do. No son of mine is going to fill in the blank, right? And so families can have a dramatic influence on how children see the world and see the world for males versus females because of that gendered socialization that occurs within the family. Okay, we see that in some societies, girls are socialized by their mothers, and sons are more socialized by their fathers. If you think about hunting and gathering societies, sons learn to hunt by watching their fathers and perhaps being able to go on hunts with their fathers when they get old enough. Girls learn to pick fruits, nuts, berries, and roots by going with their mother to do that, during the course of their day. So in some societies, we see that fathers teach their sons to be men and mothers teach their daughters to be women. But in other societies, both parents will have an impact, right? Here in our post-industrial world here in the United States, I suspect that our fathers and mothers have an influence on our socialization process as we grow up. My mom taught me a lot of things, but my dad taught me to throw a curveball and a knuckleball, and spent hours and hours with me playing baseball and learning to play the game and understand the game. But my mom didn't have those skills, but I learned to cook from watching my mom, and I learned to wash clothes and fold clothes and do those kinds of things and do some housekeeping, thankfully, because I'm a divorced person. I have to do those things for myself to a large degree, and thankfully my mom was there to kind of show me how to do those things and show me how to survive on my own. Okay. So, school is an agent of socialization. We know that there's a lot of skills. There's the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic, right? But there's also rules that we have to learn, like wait your turn in line. Don't go and cut to the front of the line. There are lots of rewards and punishments for engaging in good and bad behaviors. But conflict theorists would say that, well, the functionalists are going to focus on how we give people the skills they need to be able to survive in the economy. Conflict theorists would say that we socialize middle-class kids differently than we socialize working-class kids, differently from how we socialize upper-class kids. They're treated very differently by the schools that they attend. Based on socioeconomic status and based on gender, and so they see that as being divisive and maintaining the status quo. A child who comes from the middle class, who makes an ACT of 2020, might be encouraged to go to college, whereas a child who scores 20 on the ACT but comes from a lower class family might be steered towards a vocational program. Just as an example. The peer group is certainly a very important agent of socialization. Most sociologists would say that when kids get to about middle school on up, that peer groups become more and more important, and at some point their importance really kind of eclipses that of parents. In other words, middle school and high school kids may be more concerned about what their peers think of them than what their parents think of them. Okay, and there are some gender differences in peer groups and how they influence boys and girls in that respect. So your text talks about what makes high school girls popular and what makes high school boys popular. And what they did is they did some research where they asked freshman students what makes high school boys and high school girls popular. And they came up with some different lists. If you look at those lists, you'll see that there is some overlap. Boys and girls do see some things in similar ways, but they also see some differences there as well. So I won't spend a lot of time going over that. I'll let you guys look at that. We'll move on to mass media and technology and how it influences our lives and how it socializes us. We learn so much from things that we read on the internet, from things that we see in the television programs and the movies that we are interested in. And so 95% of American children have some access to the internet between the ages of 12 and 17. So almost all kids are somewhat influenced by the internet, social media apps and things of that nature. Of course, movies and television also influence us. Socialization is increasingly occurring online, and there's some pretty frightening things online. So if you're a parent, you need to be aware of that and educate yourself so that you can provide appropriate safeguards to make sure that your children aren't being exposed to harmful things on the internet. And people have been socialized into relying on these new communication technologies. Now we just accept that, well, hey, here's a new social media app. Here's a new streaming platform. And we accept those pretty quickly and embrace them, and they can have an impact on our behavior. But we see that not all of these communication technologies are available all around the world. There are some countries where the internet is very, very expensive, internet access. So, for example, there are some African nations where dial-up internet, which I suspect that nobody in this class has dial-up internet, but in other countries it's still fairly common. It's much slower. The size of the files that you can download are much smaller. But in some African countries, it might cost $300 or $400 a month to have dial-up internet access, and high-speed internet access is just not even possible. So here in the U.S., we're very lucky that we have the technology that's reasonably affordably available to most of us. And if it's not present in our home, we can go to the library and use the internet, or we can park outside McDonald's and use the internet through their Wi-Fi. So there are a lot of ways of getting access to it here in the United States that may not be true in other countries that are developing nations. Okay. But as parents, we need to be monitoring what our children are seeing. And so you've got some box 4-3 shows parental monitoring of teenagers' online activity. And they're showing what, here in the United States, what parents do in regards to children who are 13 to 14 years of age versus those children who are 15 to 17. And you'll see that in every case, there is slightly more monitoring of 13 and 14-year-old kids and their use of the internet than there are for those that are 15 to 17. Okay, so it presents some unique challenges in terms of trying to make sure that our children are protected and learning things that we want them to learn and not bad things or things that we see as threatening. Okay, the workplace is also an agent of socialization. As we mentioned, you learn a lot about what's expected of you in different work environments. When you go to work, they go through an orientation process. That process may just be showing you where the deep fryer is and telling you, here's the handbook, you're supposed to wear your hairnet when you're frying French fries and all that kind of stuff, or it can be more regulated, more formalized. Okay, as a new employee, these are the videos you need to watch, and this is what you need to do to prepare to be an employee of this organization. And here's the big thick handbook that you need to read and understand in order to be a good employee. And then here's the things that you're going to do in your everyday job. We're going to show you how to do that as well. So the workplace socialization can be pretty slender and slim. It can be just, hey, here's the deep fryer, and you put the fries in for 3 minutes and the buzzer goes off and you pull them out, and then you salt them and you put them in the orders. Or it can take weeks and months to be oriented to a new job. Okay, we see that between the ages of 18 and 48, the average person has held 12 jobs. So that means that some of us are going to stay in the same job most of our lives, but that's becoming less common today. Even people that stay in the same industry will move around some. There's less loyalty to the company, and the company has less loyalty to its employees. And so today it's very likely that you're going to move around. Even if you stay within the same industry and the same general job title, you will move around from one organization to another, and they all have their unique ways of doing things. So there will always be some socialization that occurs with a new job. Of course, I talked a little bit about religion and its impact as an agent of socialization. We learn to celebrate Christmas and Easter rather than Hanukkah or Ramadan or some of those other holidays and rituals that go along with different faiths. We learn that if you go to synagogue, that's a different experience than if you go to a Catholic Mass, than if you go to a Southern Baptist service, and going to an African American church might be different than going to a Protestant church that is comprised primarily of white members. And so all those kinds of things can influence us, but religion and the state can influence us by teaching us what some people feel are good moral theories about what's right and wrong. I think most of us would agree that, taking other people's property, taking someone's life, those are very egregious violations of the social contract and social expectations. And you don't have to be a religious person to be a moral person. In most people's views, you can be a good person who is honest and trustworthy and does good things for other people without having a belief in any kind of higher power. But we tend to associate morality with being, a member of some religious faith. And here in the U.S., of course, Christianity is more highly valued than most other faiths. Okay. And I talked about how government makes rules and passes laws that affects our behavior as well. So as I said, sociologists tend to look at socialization as being something that happens over the course of a person's life. It's not something that just happens when they're young. As young adults, we have to learn how to manage our finances and plan for the future, and we start engaging in coupling for the purpose of a committed relationship, perhaps. Not everybody chooses a committed relationship. There are people in society who choose not to form a committed relationship, but they are often looked at as if there's something. What's wrong with him? Why doesn't he get married? Does he have a commitment phobia? Does he have this? What's wrong with that person that they don't want to be part of a couple? There's a lot of pressure in our society to be part of a couple, a committed couple. And, you might have heard some discussions about Will Smith and Jada Pinkett Smith, where they're talking about, they were going through some rough patches in their marriage, and she got involved with someone else and had a sexual relationship with another person. And some people are saying, well, how can they still be married if she cheated and all these kinds of things? That says something about your view of morality and what you believe marriage to be about. Not everyone necessarily has the same expectations of marriage. But, that's kind of become part of American culture, is that marriage means that you love this individual and you are choosing not to have relations with other people. You are committed to this one person. It's a monogamous relationship. But, just because that's what we've seen most of our lives doesn't mean that those are the only types of marriages that can be successful and exist and be good relationships for people. But we can explore that a little more when we get to the chapter on family. All right. So as we go through our lives, yes, our families teach us a lot. We learn from our teachers and our peers and our principals and our coaches. We learn from our Sunday school teachers and our minister, pastor, preacher, imam, whatever faith we practice. We learn from our workplace and our coworkers and our boss. We have all these things that shape us as we go through life, and it happens throughout the lifetime. As I said, it's not something that just happens when you're a child and then it's over with and you are who you are and you're never going to change again. The sense of self evolves throughout the course of our lifetimes. So your text will talk about anticipatory socialization. This is when you're learning things in anticipation of future roles. So when you go to school and you learn to work math problems and write papers, that is anticipatory socialization, because the expectation is that when you become an adult, you might have a job where you have to use some math skills or some problem solving skills, or you may have to write reports. And so you're learning to do those things in anticipation of adult roles that you will play. And then your text also talks about what it calls resocialization. And this is when an individual is taken and put into an environment where they are expected to unlearn some things that they learned previously and to learn some new strategies that are deemed as more adaptive than the old behaviors. And so resocialization refers to the process of discarding former behavior patterns and accepting new ones as part of a transition in one's life. And this can be very stressful for individuals to go through resocialization. Some examples of resocialization is when an individual joins the military and goes to boot camp, and they have to unlearn a lot of behaviors and learn what it means to be a member of the Army or a Marine. And so that can be very stressful. It can be physically demanding, but it can also be psychologically stressful. Another example of a resocialization occurs if somebody has to go to a psychiatric hospital or into a prison. You have to, forget old behaviors and learn new behaviors that are going to allow you to survive in that environment. Okay. So those are what we would call total institutions. The military, a psychiatric hospital, a prison, those are all total institutions where someone else really has, tremendous control over what you do, when you do it, and how you do it. And so, all aspects of an individual's life are dictated by someone who, is either their superior officer or the warden or the psychiatric staff who are assessing this individual's mental and emotional well-being. And so you're trying to unlearn behaviors that have not been particularly useful and learn new behaviors that will be more adaptive going forward. And then sometimes people engage in behaviors that are such a violation of expectations that they go through what is called a degradation ceremony, a degradation ceremony where they are basically kicked out of the group or they are somehow demoted or made to feel less than. It's a ritual where the individual becomes secondary and rather invisible in the overbearing social environment. And that happens a lot of times in total institutions. If you think about when you join the military, you go in, you get your hair cut, you get a uniform that you have to wear every day. And, the rules are very rigidly enforced. That's a degradation ceremony. When you get your hair cut and you're given a uniform and you are now expected to come out and salute and march and, engage in all of that stuff, that's part of a degradation ceremony. When you go into prison, if they shave your head or give you a haircut and make you look kind of like other prisoners and they give you that ill-fitting prison uniform to wear. If you go into a psychiatric facility, there may be degradation ceremonies. The degradation ceremony for a psych patient might be if a judge says, you are a danger to yourself. In my judgment, you are a danger to yourself and others. Therefore, you must go to a psychiatric facility for 30 days or until, experts think you're better enough to be released. That would be a degradation ceremony. And so for some of these total institutions, being put into one of them can involve some pretty harsh experiences that can quite make the person question who they are and to change their view of who they are through the experiences they have in those total institutions. Okay. So we've all heard about midlife crises, and of course not everyone will experience a midlife crisis, but I think a lot of people do go through a period of reflection in their 40s or 50s where they think about all the goals that they had as an 18, 19, 20-year-old bright-eyed person with optimism and idealism and all of that, and then they get to their middle age period and they start to reflect on, well, how many of those goals have I reached? I wanted to do this and I wanted to do that and I haven't done any of these things. So they may experience a midlife crisis and say, hey, time's running out. I don't have as much time now as I did. If I want to do some of these things, I've got to start doing them now. And of course, our perception of a midlife crisis is, dad starts dating the secretary and buys a sports car and gets a divorce and, all that kind of stuff. That's not necessarily true. A midlife crisis can involve a career change, doing something that is more gratifying to the person. It can involve volunteering and doing things to try to make the world a better place. Midlife crises take a lot of different forms, and not everybody experiences a midlife crisis, but some people do. But there are different challenges that face people at different times in their life. Your text will talk about the sandwich generation, and this is when people have children that they're caring for at the same time that their parents are getting older, and they have to take care of those individuals as well. And they're kind of sandwiched between those two generations, the parents and the children, and they're really, in many cases, worn thin by trying to meet the needs of both their parents and their children. That can be very, very stressful. Of course, we know that the caregiving role tends to fall more to women than to men in our society. So your text talks about what it calls the daughter track. That's experienced by middle-aged women and younger women, where they are being groomed. Don't get too involved in your career, because at some point you may have to give your career up to take care of mom and dad as they get old and can't take care of themselves. Then you also have the demands that children place on you. So you're really not going to have that much time for a career. And that's kind of what they're talking about there with that daughter track. We see that by 2010, 13 million Americans were caring for both their children and their parents. That doesn't mean that mom and dad necessarily come and live with you, but if you're taking them groceries and taking them to the store and taking them to the doctor's office when they have doctor's appointments and things like that, that can be very demanding on adult children who have children of their own. And we see that even, retirement, which most of us, we think, oh, someday I'm going to retire. Life's going to be so great. I'll have worked and saved and done all this stuff, and now I'll be able to enjoy life. But for a lot of people, retirement comes with its own period of adjustment. For some people, when they retire, they lose a lot of their sense of identity and their sense of being productive individuals. And so they may go find another job or in a different industry, or they may do some consulting, or they may, become a door greeter at Walmart or something like that. And so there's this discussion about people who go back into the labor force as retirees, not necessarily because they need the money, although that may be a motivating factor, but probably more because they want something that keeps them busy. My dad's 83 years old, and his health has gotten to the point where he can't do as much as he used to, but he still likes to do things, mow the yard and keep a garden and do those kinds of things that not only give him a sense of fulfillment, but also give him a sense of, contribution to the family. And he's still an important part of the family. Just because he's gotten old and retired and all of that doesn't mean that he's not still a valuable member of the family. And so he feels compelled to do some of those things because he wants to make a contribution. He wants to be a viable part of the family. We see that from 1950 to 1990, the average retirement age declined. So people were retiring earlier. But since 1990, the average retirement age has started to increase. In 1992, 11.5% of those over the age of 64 were in the labor force. That number went up to 18.5% by 2012. And we see that by 2022, an estimated 23% of those over the age of 64 are expected to be in the labor force. So I think people are going to work longer. Even if they don't have a financial need to do so, they're going to work longer because we are healthier and living longer, and therefore people want to stay active and be a part of things because retirement is often seen as not very satisfying to retirees. Now, I think it really depends on the individual person and their approach to retirement and their expectations and what they've done to plan for that retirement. If you've been able to save enough money to retire and not have to worry about finances too much, and you can go and do the things that you wanted to do. You can travel overseas if that's been a goal of yours, if that's on your bucket list, if that's part of your retirement plan, and you're able to do that and you find that fulfilling. You may not feel that need to go back to work. You may be totally fulfilled by the experiences you're able to have. But for a lot of people, they get home, they look at their spouse, or if their spouse has passed on, they feel lonely. They want that social interaction that work provides. Let's face it, a lot of our personality is tied up in what we do for a living. I am a sociology instructor. Even though I took about 15 years out of my sociology career, teaching career, to work in administration and work in different kinds of jobs in higher education, at my heart, I still saw myself as a sociologist and as a sociology professor, teacher, and that's a big part of who I am. So even when I retire, I suspect that I will continue to teach because I really enjoy doing what I do. And it is a big part of who I am. So I think, even if it were on an adjunct part-time basis, I think I would want to continue teaching because this is really very gratifying and it makes me feel like I'm doing something useful. Okay, and that's important to us. So last couple of things I'll mention. You've got these naturally occurring retirement communities. Your text calls them NORCs. These can happen in states where the weather, Florida and Arizona, but also in certain communities. You have these kind of naturally occurring areas that become predominantly peopled by retirees. And those can be very useful. It's good if you're elderly and you're moving into an area where there are other elderly people, and there's perhaps a community center where the elderly people go and they interact with each other and they need that social engagement, that social interaction. Those naturally occurring retirement communities can be very good places for those folks to go because they are around people who are experiencing some of the same things they're experiencing, and they can kind of help each other out and be a support group. And so I see some real value to these NORCs, as your textbook calls them, because people are able to provide a support network for each other as, perhaps families have become less involved with them as they've gotten older, and so they can rely on, fellow members of the community to go to the doctor with them or to talk to them about their problems and, help them face different things and issues of that nature. So I think that's a pretty good place to stop for this chapter. I do want to mention childcare and the importance of childcare, and there's a big discussion at the end of the chapter about the importance of childcare and quality daycare. There was a lot of concern about whether daycare centers were going to be good for kids or not, and I think the research has shown that if you can afford decent quality daycare for your children, that not only are there not really negative outcomes from that, but there are some positive things, learning to get along with other kids, to share, to wait your turn in line, to hold up your hand when you have a question and not just to blurt out and interrupt your peers. All of those are skills that and knowledge that's useful later on in life. So, daycares can provide a rich environment for kids to be intellectually stimulated and socially stimulated so that they learn to develop skills and develop friendships and form bonds with each other. My best friend in high school was really my best friend through grades 1 through 12. We're still Facebook friends, and I can tell you his phone number. He doesn't live there anymore, but I can tell you what his phone number was back in 1975. But that's not very useful knowledge anymore, but for some reason that still sticks in my head. Those can be lifelong companions. They can be friends throughout your lifetime, and that can really be very valuable. So that can happen in daycare centers that are well run and organized and maintained. And so high quality daycare can be very beneficial, but it is quite expensive. For those of you that that have children in daycare, you know it can be quite expensive, particularly if you're talking about those that are run more like a school with people who have training as educators. Those daycare centers can be very expensive, but if you can afford them, they may be well worth the money because your child is having a radically different experience than very poorly run, cheaper daycare environments. So we need to think about how we want to have our children socialized. Are we going to have to rely on daycare? If so, how are we going to afford daycare that provides a meaningful childhood for our kids so that they grow up healthy and learn the things that we want them to learn? So that's something else that we need to think about as we think about this chapter on socialization. Be on the lookout for announcements, and grades will be coming out soon, so keep an eye out for that as well. I'll get the exams graded as quickly as possible and give you some feedback on how you did and how to do better going forward. So have a great day, guys, and I hope you enjoyed this lecture.